All right. Karen, thank you so much for joining us today. We are so delighted to be able to talk about something that very few people actually consider when putting their diversity inclusion programs into place, and that is change management. And so I'd like to introduce Karen McDaniel, who's our guest today. Karen is the founder and principal consultant of Culture Forward, and she has had experience leading Fortune 1000 at Fortune 1000 companies leading diversity and inclusion strategies. Karen, I'll let you give a little bit more background on yourself.
Great, thank you. And first of all, thank you for inviting me to speak today. Diversity, equity, and inclusion and change management are both like just two huge passions of mine. And I see there's a lot of opportunity to help people out there with the with the DEI journey. So I'm really excited to see the intersection of this conversation happen today. So yeah, as you mentioned, I've worked at a variety of companies and had various exposure to diversity, equity, and inclusion programs and transformational change journeys from a lot of different domains. And so, I often see companies leading DEI as a program or as, we're going to set a diversity and inclusion goal. And they're not really hitting the mark on understanding the level of change that goes into really driving meaningful change in this space. And so
I can't agree with you more, because a lot of the times even though people think they're going to develop a diversity strategy, it's very tactical, right? They focus on operational things, right? What's the body count, and how many women or members of underrepresented communities do we get in the pipeline? But I don't think folks have taken a step back to really understand that this is a big psychological change and a cultural change for the organization. And so it's a pleasure. It's wonderful that you approach this in that way. And maybe we can start the conversation by talking about why we need to consider this a diversity program as a change program.
Yeah, so, reflecting back on some things that I've seen, I worked with a company that when I joined them, they had diversity and inclusion goals. And they had them for a couple of years. So they would set goals like, we need to hire more women. So they would see that their gender balance wasn't what they thought it could be, and they'd set out to, let's hire more women. But by just setting those goals, and even if you're a very goal-oriented company and you're going to crush those goals, it's not necessarily going to drive the right kind of change, because if you're not looking at things holistically and understanding your environment that you're hiring people into, you can lose them as fast as, if not faster, than you're actually hiring them. So you're setting goals and you're crushing your goals, but you're not really driving meaningful change. And so that's why you really need to take that intentional change leadership approach to this work.
Wonderful. And can you explain a little bit more what you mean by intentional change leadership?
Yeah, so I would say, I'm seeing a lot of companies right now just jump in and say, they're getting pressure from their board, they're getting pressure from investors, they're getting pressure from candidates who are asking them what they have in place from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective. And so they're rushing in to say, let's put some employee resource groups in place. Let's put some training programs in place. And when you just jump right into doing those things, it can really come across as like fake allyship or optical allyship. So it can come across as not genuine, and that can actually backfire on you. So when I say doing intentional change leadership on this, I'm really taking the approach of looking at your environment, doing an assessment of your landscape, looking at the readiness of your organization, and figuring out what is the right place to dive in and get started.
I love that. And in some of our previous conversations, you mentioned that, a lot of folks are taking the one size fits all. Diversity is follow step 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And you're saying, no, don't do that. And you're talking a little bit about assessing your landscape. So let's start with that. Could you tell us a little bit more about what you mean?
Yeah, so again, with any change, you want to assess what's going on. You want to do some discovery work, right? And so for DEI work, I think it breaks into three basic categories. So number one, you do want to look at your numbers, right? You do want to understand the makeup of your workforce from a demographics perspective. So it's good to get your arms around what is my workforce made up of. So look at things like what's your gender balance, what is your proportion of people of color in the company. Look at things like promotion rates. So you do really want to have a clear understanding of your data. But that's just a place to start, right? So the second thing that you really want to assess about your landscape is its inclusiveness. So a lot of companies have engagement surveys in place, and that's great because they're taking a look at, how engaged is my workforce, and that's a very powerful tool. But I would encourage people to actually think about adding some questions into those surveys, or even do a separate survey and really just pulse the environment on their inclusiveness. And so you can ask questions of all individuals and say, do you feel like your voice is being heard? Do you feel like your contributions matter, make a difference at this company? Do you feel like you have a sense of belonging? And so asking those questions can help you really understand if people are able to do their best work at your company, and that will help you understand, is this an inclusive environment? So then I would say the third thing you need to assess about your landscape is really looking at your practices. What do you have in place that ensures that you have fair and equitable practices in your company? So you can look at, and when I say practices, I'm really thinking about talent management practices. So look at the things that you're doing to attract candidates to your company. Look at your interviewing processes and make sure you've got diverse interviewing panels. Look at the way that you develop people within your company and the way that you make decisions about who gets promoted to a management role and who ends up on a succession plan. So looking at that entire, landscape of practices that make decisions about how people succeed or don't succeed within your company is also really important. And there's a really cool resource out there that I came across a few months ago that I love. It's from Life Learning Labs, and it's a diversity, equity, inclusion playbook. Mm-hmm. And, my whole message today is like, everybody shouldn't be following the same playbook, but there is some stuff in there that is, it's not about the solutions, it's about the approach that I think are really helpful. And they have a good checklist in there of things that you should look at in terms of your talent practices to make sure that you're kind of doing things fairly and equitably.
No, at Emtrain, we specialize in the second piece of what you said, and that's assessing inclusivity. And I really think that is a piece that people just miss, or they sort of clump it up with the employee engagement and employee satisfaction survey, but that doesn't actually assess inclusiveness, right? Like, you can have a very homogenous group that's very engaged and it doesn't tell you, if there's groups that feel left out or all of that. And so I think that resonates very much with me because, I'm a psychologist, right, by training. And what I do believe is invisible are the thing. What I believe is that folks don't pay attention to those invisible things, right? Because we can do a body count, we can see race, we can see gender, we can see age, we can see all of those things, and we can very much measure and operationalize recruitment questions. But I think that measuring inclusiveness is important. I want to go a little bit further and ask you a little bit about how to even prepare people to measure inclusivity. Like, what do you think are the best approaches as we talk even to our own client base? How do you think folks are most receptive to hearing those messages? Or, you know, what's the best way for one executive to communicate to another, say the program manager to communicate to their business leaders what exactly they're measuring when they're measuring things like inclusivity and why?
Yeah, yeah. When I worked at Intuit, we were very big on innovation practices. And one of the key elements of design thinking is really around go broad and then go narrow. And so when I say, do your engagement surveys, collect that data on a very broad basis, that will give you insights into how your organization is performing kind of on average or in aggregate. And so what I recommend people do then is take that data and really start to slice it and dice it by different segments of your population so you can understand, like, where is there a baseline experience happening, and then where are there pockets of your organization that are really struggling with some things or facing some challenges. So it's important to identify those discrepancies. And then I would say it's really, really important to follow that up with discussion, because a score or a rating is only going to tell you so much, even if they provide some comments or kind of standalone comments, and you really need to start to draw that context a little bit better by getting out there and talking to people. And so I would say focus groups are a really great way to follow up survey findings. Get out there and pull small groups of people together in an intimate environment where you can create some psychological safety and kind of get them to open up and start sharing their experiences and telling their stories to you, so you can really paint that picture of what's happening. And so then when you've got the data and then backing it up with human stories and human experiences, it really helps the leaders to start telling their story to their organization of, here's what's important, here's how we're doing, here's how it's going, here's some individual, comments or some individual examples of how that shows up. And that starts to inspire the human connection and engage individuals in really wanting to be a part of, fixing the problems that are out there.
I really love that, because I think that allows the client or whomever is pulling this information together. For me, I'm looking at it from our client's perspective. If we empower them to do the focus groups around the findings, then they tell each other the story and they build that learning internally. And I think that's necessary work, right? That's necessary work that organizations probably should do, so that they always have a way of hearing people's voices internally. That the engagement survey, the numbers on their own don't really do this justice, right? You don't.
Yeah. Where I think another good source of these stories is in your leavers, the people who are leaving your company. So hopefully companies out there are collecting exit data. I know a lot of people do surveys. They think it's a lot of overhead to try to talk to every single person who leaves the company. But I would say an exit interview is a golden opportunity to, you see who's leaving in your data, but then you can sit down with them and ask some pointed questions. So for example, if you're seeing our people of color are leaving the company at a faster rate than their white counterparts, then you can ask some pointed questions in those exit interviews and say, what made it hard to be successful in this company as a person of color? And you can really, when you ask those kind of questions, you're being very vulnerable. I know a lot of people are skeptical about, do people really tell the truth in exit interviews? But when you can really put yourself out there and ask the tough questions and invite those responses, I do think that they will open up and share their perspective, and you can just learn so much from that. And again, that gives you, employees don't want their counterparts to leave. They don't like it when there's attrition at their company. It's painful to them. They've got to help retrain someone. So people get engaged in attrition discussions. And so if you can bring them back stories of, here's really why people are leaving, it can, again, just inspire them to want to make a difference and change things.
Okay, and again, all of this is in support of some data collection and a surveyed landscape kind of effort.
Right.
And so now you've got all these data, and you don't recommend that people you said that people shouldn't rush in and necessarily without doing that data collection, rush in and do a bunch of different things. I would think that once you have all of that, you have to sort of build alignment across the different stakeholders, and maybe you put your strategic plan together. Does that sound right to you? Is that how you would typically approach that?
Yeah. Gather your data, get your stories. I would say put together a package of key messages that you can arm your leaders with, and help them understand here are the things we want our people to experience and feel and think about working here. So you get the communications aspect of that, get your leaders aligned to that. And then you can start thinking about, well, what programs do we want to put in place? And by the way, I'm not saying, ERGs are not effective or they're not important. It's just that you want to make sure that you're doing them for the right reasons and that they're actually going to solve a problem for you. Because I've seen a number of companies implement ERGs and then nobody attends them.
Right.
Or even worse, I've had companies where, the people who were more in the majority group were feeling kind of resentful, like, where's my ERG? I need to be developed too. And so that's a sign that, maybe your environment isn't as educated on the importance of inclusion, and it doesn't have maybe enough sympathy for, the needs of other people. So I would say that's kind of an example of assessing your stakeholders and, really taking a temperature for, are people ready to support these types of programs? So, identify what programs you think might solve some of the needs that you're seeing in your data and your stories across your company. But then also do some work, get out there and talk to some people and say, hey, we're thinking of doing this, gather diverse perspectives on some of those ideas that you want to implement. And that'll give you kind of a feeling of the temperature of the room when you try to implement these things. Are they going to go over like a lead balloon, or are they going to be, warmly embraced? And so
that is
understand
so
your stakeholders.
That is so funny, Karen, because sometimes there is a lot of pushback, and what you just said is gold. So I want to just sort of summarize this for people, because what I think most folks do is think that the survey or the training or the ERG is the entire inclusion and diversity strategy, and they don't realize that, really, that's step one of the assessment process, right? We're starting with the survey, we're doing the focus group. All of this is just laying the groundwork, and that this is really could potentially be a years long process depending on the size of the company, right?
I would say it's more than a years long process. I mean, once you start this work, it should just be something that you are always driving for, making sure you've got an inclusive environment and making sure you've got the diversity that you need in your teams so that they can be, innovative and break through constraints and, have breakthrough ideas. So it's not something you do a series of, interventions or programs. It's ongoing work. It's not
Right.
that's I think that's kind of one of the things that comes to mind when I think they run it like a program. Well, programs typically have starts and ends, but this is an ongoing journey. It should be a forever practice, and it's just a matter of getting yourself off the ground with it.
Here's where I wish I had a slide, but let me, because I want to graphically represent. So what you're saying is, the first part, this assessment, is really the beginning. I'm saying that it could definitely take a while. The assessment process could be in itself a year per se, depending upon the size of your company, right? And then there's the alignment piece that you were talking about. And I think that that is really missing in a lot of change management DEI. It's missing in a lot of DEI where they don't take it as a change management. And that you said something about getting messaging correctly done and having people aligned to messaging. So can you say a little bit about that piece?
Yeah, there's a really great tool in the world of communications called a message map. And it really just helps you think through, like, what are the key things I'm solving for? What ways am I going to try to solve those things? What's important? And also, this is a good opportunity to think through who are the resistors, because I'll tell you, if you move forward with change and you've got entire organizations where this, senior leadership isn't aligned with the importance of this work, it can actually make things worse for those employees in that organization. So when I say have key messages, I mean, get out and talk to those leaders. Like we said, like, assess their readiness to embrace this stuff. If they're pushing back, then have some key messages of helping them. Maybe they need to understand more the business side of it versus the human side of it. And so have those key talking points where you can help them understand why we're moving forward with this, even if they don't think it's important. Find a way to connect it to the things that are important to them. And so those key messages kind of just help you continue to engage those leaders and bring them on board if maybe they weren't the first to jump on board in the first place.
So I've seen that type of resistance where employees have felt put in the middle of the initiative, where they don't exactly know where their leader stands or why they are not feeling comfortable. I've also seen folks that just push things like unconscious bias training as, we're doing a DEI and the first thing we're going to do is unconscious bias training. And can you talk a little bit about that approach too? Because I think that it's a very common one.
Yeah, I would say almost all companies right now are engaging in unconscious bias training, right? And I think they should be, but there's also a lot of articles out there saying, no, wait, unconscious bias training doesn't fix anything. I think it's an and. So I look at unconscious bias training as table stakes. I feel like everybody should go through it. But again, you have to understand what's the readiness of your population to go through that discussion. Because if they're resistant to it, then you need to think of different ways to approach the conversation. So for example, like, maybe you don't call it unconscious bias training. Like, people get defensive when you tell them that they have biases that they're not aware of. They don't want to hear that. They don't want to think that about themselves. But there's still ways to help them understand. You can use words like, your brain makes shortcuts. Your brain's evolved a certain way over time for a survival perspective. And, these shortcuts were wired into our brain to help us categorize things as safe or not safe. And so this is where this evolved in our brains, but that can also work against us when we're trying to make good, thoughtful decisions about how we treat people, how we include people, or even how we make business decisions. So, these are the times when we want to stop and think about the way we're categorizing people or judging people or making decisions about people. And so I think unconscious bias can be like game changing for some individuals, and, can be just kind of like baseline for other individuals. And so it's again, like, knowing your environment, knowing your culture and how those messages are going to be received, and then finding the way to land the plane with them.
So I'm hearing you say, and this is interesting, and I don't know where folks fall on this. I'm learning oriented, right? But I do feel that there's somewhat of a, how do I explain it? There's a need for people to understand the importance of this as a body of work, that this is inclusion, that this is diversity. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm a little bit torn, right? Because I do think that people should learn and practitioners I would like to take the approach. I always want to take the approach of how is it that I'm going to help the person in front of me learn this skill? And I'm conflicted about having to change its name.
Well, and I would say those are probably the more extreme cases. So I wouldn't recommend everybody, kind of cloak their unconscious bias training in some, bland vanilla terms. But I'm just saying, if you assess your landscape and you're like, they're not ready to hear this, there's big pushback on this topic, there's ways that you can ease them into it and understand it.
Absolutely. And we fall back also to explaining, instead of the social side and the human side, we talk about explaining the business side of decision-making processes and removing error in decision-making processes by, using a more structured approach. And the beauty of it is it's really true for both the decision-making business side and the social side, which is why it's such great work. Karen, thank you so much for that insight that inclusion and diversity is also a change management program, and we should treat it that way. It's such a valuable perspective. I can't thank you enough.
Thank you. Thank you for the great, insightful questions.
And Karen's company is Culture Forward. Karen, your website is cultureforward.com. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct. And people can find me on LinkedIn and connect with me there as well.
And then I want.
Leann, you're breaking up on us.
Perfect. All right. And John, I'll go to you. I'm sorry. Oh.
Well, Leann, your connection's broken up a little bit, but I think we're wrapping up for this session. And I thank you, all the viewers who were with us today, and we'll share this broadcast if you find it valuable and want to share with others as well.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.